Hello, my name is Aram Moshayedi, the Hammer Museum's Robert Soros curator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third iteration of Reimagining the Museum, an ongoing series of public programs that aims to address the colonial legacies embedded in the history of cultural institutions. Today's program, titled Repatriation and Ruin, was conceived and organized by the Hammer's curatorial assistants Ikechukwu Onyewenyi and Nicholas Barlow. I want to start by thanking them for taking the lead with this and assembling a grouping of films and speakers that gets at the heart of the Reimagining series and that addresses the role that museums must take in the move toward equity, justice, and anti-racism. In particular, today's program addresses the responsibilities of the traditional Western Ethnographic Museum, an institutional model that was born from imperial and colonial expansion, and that to this day often refers to the objects in its collections as being discovered or rescued from the original context in order to obscure the more nefarious histories of theft, plunder, and violence we know of the colonial project. For their part, ethnographic museums, as well as encyclopedic museums, attempt to provide a representation of the world. They are dedicated to the collection, preservation, and display of cultural artifacts that are divorced from their function and context of origin. Today's screening and discussion look specifically at the ways in which artists and filmmakers have examined this legacy, and how they can intervene and subvert ethnographic representations and practices. You Hide Me by Kwate Owoo was produced after the Ghanaian filmmaker and scholar was able to gain unprecedented access in 1970 to the British Museum's collection of ritual artifacts, artworks, and cultural objects, largely pillaged during ethnographic expeditions. You Hide Me has had a lasting and significant influence on subsequent generations of filmmakers, even though the film was widely censored in the UK upon completion and banned from screening in Ghana for purported anti-British sentiments. You Hide Me will screen immediately following the presentation of two recent films by London-based artist and researcher Onyeka Igwe. 50 years separate Owoo's film and Igwe's No Archive Can Restore You and Specialized Technique, which in many ways deals with the aftermath and reverberations of the so-called colonial past. Igwe's first film looks at the haunted ruins of the former Nigerian film unit in Lagos, Nigeria, while the second re-inhabits and reanimates reels of ethnographic film footage showing tribal dance, slowing, scratching, and manipulating the images as a way of freeing captive Black life. The presentation of these three films will then be followed by a discussion with the filmmakers, moderated by Berlin-based curator, publisher, and cultural historian Clémentine Deliss, whose most recent publication, The Metabolic Museum, offers a pointed critique of the contemporary practices of ethnographic museums. Ike and Nick will also be on hand to field any questions from the audience. As something of a coda, Repatriation and Ruin will conclude with a special screening of Chris Marker and Alain Resnais's influential essay film from 1953, Statues Also Die, which offers another controversial look into the holdings and practices of the Museum of Man in Paris. We would like to offer a few brief acknowledgements for this program. Thank you to Lux, London, Presence Africaine Editions, and June Giovanni for their help in securing the films. Thank you also to Erica Jones from UCLA's Fowler Museum and KJ Ralph Miller from the UCLA Film and Television Archive for their assistance and professional guidance. And we are particularly grateful to the efforts of the Hammer staff in organizing the screening and conversation that follows. Specifically, thank you to Alexander Barrera, Brian Springer, and the entire technical team, as well as Claudia Bester and our colleagues from public programs. The Hammer's curatorial department has rallied behind the Reimagining series, and we are thankful for the collective efforts of the department. Connie Butler, Erin Cristoval, Vanessa Arizmendi, and Nika Chelowich. And now I'll leave you with Repatriation and Ruin. Thank you.
Hello to everyone that's listening into this live event of the Hammer Museum. Hello to those who have entered this recording at a later date. My name is Clémentine Deliss. I'm Associate Curator at KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin, where I'm developing the Metabolic Museum University with a faculty of artists, writers, social designers, musicians, and lawyers. And together we're looking at the politics of collecting in Berlin and developing a new multidisciplinary methodology with which to try to interpret contentious collections. Meanwhile, in Lagos, I'm working with Azu Nwagbogu, director of the African Artists Foundation, and developing Generator, a long-term infrastructure that focuses on restitution and future museology in Nigeria, but also in Africa. And to kickstart this process, we initiated homemuseum.net for Lagos Photo Festival 2020, creating a digital participatory platform for a citizens museum, which has effectively ignited conversations around restitution and collecting in Africa and beyond. Now, before I go further into the discussion today, I'd like to introduce the artists. Kwate Owoo was born and raised in Ghana and has been producing and directing films since the early 70s. After graduating from the London Film School, he formed the first independent African film production company in the UK, and under the auspices of this new production company, made his first film, You Hide Me, which you've just seen. Nikwate's biography demonstrates his unflinching commitment to Pan-Africanism, his engagement in setting up film festivals, editing journals on African cinema, and building research institutes for media and film in Ghana. He is also a key member of AfriTeam, the Association for Reclamation and Return of African Artifacts hidden in American, British, and European museums. Onyeka Igwe was born in London, where she's based. She uses dance, voice, archives, narration, and text to create a format in art that exposes a multiplicity of narratives. In particular, Onyeka's films have a rhythmic editing style that amplify the dissonance that occurs between image and sound. She questions the camera as if it was an embodied technology of repression, eradication, and framing. In both films, you get a sense of a camera movement that defies being pulled down toward the ground, curving away or pulling back the POV and questioning the dominant optic of colonial representation. In 2019, Onyeka was a recipient of the Berwick New Cinema Award, and in 2020, she was given the Arts Foundation Futures Award for experimental short film. KW curator, my colleague, Mason Lever Yap, recently produced an excellent conversation between the artist and Aisha Ariela Azoulay, which I encourage you to look at and which can be found on the website of KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. Now, before I address the questions around restitution raised by their wonderful films, I wish to pay respect to the nearing 500,000 lives lost in the US as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge those on the front line who are caring for the afflicted. I want to do this with a short text, very short, that I wrote in April of last year. The Museum Lazaret. The museum is empty of walking human beings. It's become a lazaret for vulnerable bodies. With frescoes on the ceiling, the line "Watch the pursuits of angels in the embrace of flesh and cloud." Paintings are hung lower than usual to match the bedridden gaze. Spotlights complement the micro-focus of each prostrate sufferer. No longer controlled by the norms of visitation, curators tend to patients, not publics, offering solace and comfort. Performing subtle operations such as listening, whispering, or awakening, they speak to the suffering through visual projections and spoken words that re-energize the metabolic flow. Through the agency of art, they transport the immobile person out of their solitary imagination. Curators are nurses restituting lives. In the Museum Lazaret, all artworks become returns, points of reflection and objects of virtue, like chairs in a room ready to greet a conversation. But artworks today are interlocutors who don't speak the Eurocentric canon any longer. They are multiple agents, double-crossing their original tongues in line with their neighbor's expression. Dragged down into lowercase, the act of remediation draws them out of sleep and into a common condition. Vaccination clinic or lazaret, the museum takes on this fateful yet auspicious turn, translocating its functions from its ubiquitous imperial classicism or 20th century colonial modernity to a borderless venue, a collective crucible. In the museum, curators care for the growing, the dying, for healing and restituting, addressing the mysteries of life and death through artworks in every medium that we can imagine. So restitution is a necessary metabolic requirement in these ailing times. Yet, how does one work with imperial institutions and place their distressing and abused collections into the central focus of civic responsibility for future generations? How can one dissolve, suspend, and find critical and creative alternatives to existing taxonomies so deeply entwined with colonialist research? Now, in global art history, it's very common to recognize 1989 as a moment of transformation. So you have the dissolution of the Soviet state, the demolition of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, but you also have a watershed moment in exhibition making, blockbuster exhibition making, when the exclusive North American, Western European art world is irredeemably confronted with alternative modernities and contemporary art forms from the global South. So 30 years on and one generation later, the emphatic awareness created by Black Lives Matter has brought with it a further floodgate, a second paradigmatic shift, shaping how arts institutions contend today with representation and equity. Now, in order to heal, remediate the materialized trauma inherent in imperial and colonial museums, access to sequestered collections is an absolute decolonial imperative. Between 2010 and 2015, I took on the controversial and totally non-redemptive role of directing a so-called ethnographic museum in Germany. This museum in Frankfurt holds over 70,000 artifacts and artworks from Africa, Oceania, Southeast Asia, and the Americas, as well as 100,000 photographs and films. I knew I was facing an impossible task, but I had to begin somewhere, and it felt like working with this contentious collection was probably the most urgent thing I could do as a curator. So I began to prioritize the space of the museum. Like the lazaret, I created a new workspace that included studios and apartments in order to provide a spatial configuration for the slow process of remediation to take its course. So actually living in the museum, artists, lawyers, writers, and filmmakers could work with the collection as they wished in their own time with 24-hour unmonitored access. The museum became a crucible for negotiating new relationships and responsibilities with regard to the collection, suspending the kind of monoculture of ethnography and its presentation of cultural singularities, or on the other side, the masterpieces of so-called tribal art. This controversial reframing of what can only be seen today as a defunct colonial museum was the precursor of what I call today a museum university. In other words, a kind of the potential to clash venues that have this racist, colonial, imperial history, to clash them and transvest their modus operandi. This is different to the university gallery, okay, which is so central to US academia. With the museum universities, what you're basically doing is taking the collections and bringing them up out of the debasement of the cellar, up into the museum. And in doing that, you immediately contradict the consumerist walkthrough. You set up tables, chairs, technology, you bring in students. Collections become agents in the development of alternative art histories, not the colonialist discourse of research, but processes of retrieval, gathering, decoding, and restituting, doing what Saidiya Hartman so beautifully calls a work of critical fabulation. It's not gloating at open storage, but establishing a shift in how we use museums today. So moving away from easy consumerism to nurturing the democratic intellect for generations to come. So tonight, I think that the question of access in relation to so-called ethnographic collections is central. I say so-called not only to pay respect to Onyeka and the so-called archive, but also because I don't believe an ethnographic museum can exist today. Now, access to collections hoarded and buried in the vaults of museums is effectively impossible. Access would make us and make the custodians and the museum directors confront the pernicious ideology of conservation. Conservation is not the same all over the world, but here in Europe, where I'm speaking from, and in the US, conservation means no blood, no oil, no sweat, no breath, no friction. In other words, no human relationship to the objects in the collection. When you look at Kwate Owoo's film, You Hide Me, you see to your horror that even after 50 years, nothing has changed, and that demands for both access and restitution continue regardless. Academia, academia makes small, very polite steps forward, but what can be done to dislodge this moral high ground of the great museums, the universalist museums, and who dislodges it? How do we get these collections? How do we get access to these collections in order to think them through new eyes, new polycultural methods of interpretation? So I would like to kickstart the debate tonight by discussing illegitimacy. And I'd like to ask Kwate Owoo first, the big question that we've all been asking ourselves, and that is, how did you gain access to the British Museum in 1970? And when you've answered, I'll come to Onyeka and ask you, Onyeka, about the question of illegitimacy.
How did I gain access? Well, I believe I pulled a fast one on the museum authorities. And it's like, you know, when you are involved in a kind of a situation where you want to penetrate a wall, a steel or an iron curtain or whatever, you have to devise a strategy and tactics. And in those days, you know, I was a very strong Black power advocate. I was part of a Black Unity and Freedom Party movement in London, in England. And I used to dress completely in black with my black beret, my turtleneck, and, you know, overcoat and what have you. So I took a walk into the museum and I went to the Africa section, and what I saw there blew my mind. I went to the area where they just have these glass cases and etc. Then something struck me that, hey, these images, you know, have to be retrieved one way or the other. So I went to the administration office and to request whether I can make an appointment to meet the museum, the director of the curator of the Africa section. His name, I don't know whether he's still alive, William Fagg. He was a former British colonial officer in Nigeria. And I realized that, no, I have to change costumes. You know, it didn't sound correct to me that I could just go there with my old Black power, you know, costume and package. So I went out to London into the, some area in London. I don't remember the name of the street. and rented a three-piece suit. I rented a three-piece suit. The traditional three-piece suit with a chain and a little watch that you put in the breast pocket. And on the day of the appointment, I went up there and I was ushered up to his office. When I entered the office, he literally got up to welcome me. Now, when somebody gets up from their chair, especially the boss, to welcome you, it means that, you know, it's a gesture. So I thought that, wow. And he said, okay, young man, sit down. What can I do for you? I said, well, I'm here to pay tribute and an homage to you. Precisely because if it hadn't been for you and your level of organization and ability to preserve rare artifacts, and these African artifacts which I saw in the Africa section downstairs, these things would have vanished into thin air. And I don't think anybody today, African or otherwise, you know, would have seen any of it. There will be no remnants. So I'm here to pay tribute to you. And I want to do that by making a film about you and your, you know. So it's like, see, the English and dog lovers, you know, the English and dogs are very, so I threw a bone, you know, it was like throwing a bone, you know, and he grabbed it and he said, look, what you saw downstairs was only 2% of our collection. The rest is down below me as I sit here with you. Would you like to see it? I said, yeah, sure. So he took me to a back door in his office, opened the office, and then appeared a spiral staircase, a metal spiral staircase down. When we went down, so almost about 50 feet below the staircase. And when we landed in it, the basement of the museum, the vaults, and he said, there you are, this is the Africa section. I mean, I had to exercise a lot of self-control, and I did. I was mesmerized, but I said, well, I'm ready to roll. When can I start? Then he said, okay, you can start in a few days' time. I have to organize the security for you, and you have to pay at least about 300 pounds, and you have to work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Wow. And there will be 15 security officers who will monitor your activities and your crew to make sure that you don't steal any of the objects we stole from you or looted. So I said, hey, boom. So that's how I got in there.
300 pounds 50 years ago is a lot of money, right?
Yeah, tell me about it.
It's outrageous that he made you pay. I mean, Onyeka, you know, we speak today nearly about an archival turn in art, and that what interests me in this archival turn is how one can destabilize the pressure of a contextual legitimacy. So in that sense, I wanted to ask you if you feel in any way that one should show reverence toward the British concept of the archive, the colonial concept of the archive. And I wondered, when you were making the film on the Nigerian film unit, if you could recognize how this colonial concept of the archive remained ingrained in Nigeria. Was it, in your mind, legitimate as a transmission of history? Or did you need to, in your words, highlight fallacy and shame something?
I think for the first part, I would say the experience of doing research into the British colonial film unit and the archive of those films, I kind of was like some kind of unlearning of a reverence for archives. Like, I grew up my whole life in the UK and was educated and socialized in certain ways of knowing, in certain ways in which in which history and knowledge is transmitted. And going to the archives was always kind of taught as this first step. and as someone who's really interested or animated in some way by political and historical questions, it always seemed self-evident at the time to go and looking in the archive. Even though when I went looking, I encountered something, some kind of tension, something conflictual, something horrific, something violent at times. But from this conversation that I had with Aisha, Azule, like she was talking about how you kind of are taught to love it. You're taught to have reverence for it, and I really recognize that. And I feel like, yeah, I'm stepping away from it, or trying to step away from that kind of instilled reverence. And the second part of your question, I think it's complicated. I wouldn't like to say that I can speak for what the Nigerian relationship is to the British colonial legacy. That's obviously very complex and diffuse, and it works in different ways. But the film was prompted by a research trip that I did in 2018, and I went to visit a couple of film archives in Nigeria, in Jos and in Lagos. And what I kind of experienced was this kind of sometimes a hesitance or a reluctance, or for many different reasons, to see the material that I was looking at, to be able to see the material I was looking at. Sometimes it was because of kind of complex, weird geopolitical kind of things. For example, the German foreign ministry has like funded an archival, a film scanner to copy and preserve the film material. But the person who installed it didn't give instructions. So even though they taught them how to use it, the people who worked at the archive how to use it, there wasn't a way for them to like verify and check things when they went wrong, to troubleshoot, I should say. So that meant that it was actually hard to make scans of the film. So there's some kind of like practical issues at play. But also I did definitely encounter from the few people that I met, and I went to a conference about archives when I was there, that there was a bit of an attitude of, why are you interested in this stuff? Why do you want to rehash these kind of shameful histories? So, and also there's some kind of attitudes towards archive and preservation and keeping that is like anti-state, which is like, I don't want the state to have this proof, this documentation of me. So there's like lots of different things going on. I was interested in that, my inability to see some of the things that I wanted to see when I went there. And also I was kind of struck about my particular relationship to archives that became so obvious when I was in Nigeria.
But could you imagine, when we speak about restitution, there is material that obviously has been looted and plundered, that is iconic and important, and it can be both ritual sculpture. It can also be the brilliance and the live wires of ingenuity that you find in everyday objects that the ethnographic so-called collections in Europe, they're not so worried about. They don't speak about the restitution of a fishing net, for example. But then there's a vast amount of colonial photography that has been produced. Do you feel that this violent and obscene material should be sent back? Or do you also think that some of the colonial archives should be returned back to the former, colonizers? How do you see the movement of restitution taking place?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
I think some of this stuff, I think of it in the terms of a lot of the collections are hoarded. Like, it's institutions, museums, universities, hoarding material. And it's another way of like retaining, like if we think about colonialism as this extractive relationship, if we want to call it a relationship, but extractive, as extractive, like these collections are still the ways in which, for example, if I'm talking about Britain can hoard and hold on and extract from former colonies. So I think I guess I have been interested in the last 2 films I've made in thinking through this idea of what does it mean for the museum, the archive to be emptied? What does it mean for it to be laid ruin? Like, of course, some material people in certain spaces want and they want back, and there's like active campaigns around that. But some material maybe should just not exist anymore. And I think, for example, a kind of collection that I was interested in consists of a lot of the colonial administrators and their families, their personal collections, their images, their photographs, their letters, their films of their experiences in across the whole of the former British colonies. And that material is donated to museums and is now collected and is now monetized without any kind of permission being granted from the people that are captured by this material, and consigning certain levels of worth and legacy and historicism onto the individuals who were part of this colonial regime. And I'm not really sure what that material tells us about, apart from tells us about the colonizers. I'm not personally invested in the continued existence and the continued valorization of that kind of material.
I mean, it's a huge amount of work. And I guess that brings me to Kwate. I would like to ask you, because I know you're involved in this in Ghana, but how can one go about impressing the question of restitution as a central problematic in Africa as well as in Europe? I mean, we hear so much about restitution nowadays, and it's a fairly new phenomenon that it's a kind of a coffee table discussion already, or dinner table discussion rather. But often I get the impression that it's actually just a proxy debate between different cultural ministries in Germany and Britain and Belgium and Holland and yeah, France. But what do you feel is, how do you read the question of restitution in Ghana at the moment?
Well, you see, first of all, let's start from the premise that a collective amnesia has been imposed over the mindset of our people about these artifacts. I mean, the average Ghanaian is just trying to survive. And in terms of the culture, okay, there was a couple of years ago, there was this movement called the Year of Return, which brought in for the first time several hundred, perhaps a couple of thousand African Americans from the diaspora, Caribbean and elsewhere to Ghana. And that kind of reawakened people's spirit as to what we have lost, either through slavery and so on and so forth. So the restitution debate also was somehow rekindled. And now it's clear that in order for us to enlighten our people and to bring the attention of our government and our ministries, the relevant ministries, it was important to start an association, an organization that will start an educational process and to raise the level of consciousness of our people. And we decided that after You Hired Me won the prize, the documentary prize for the short film of the Paris Festival last year, it kind of brought this to the attention of the Ghanaian media. So for the first time, it was discussed on Ghana television that, hey, guess what? A Ghanaian film made 50 years ago won this thing and so on and so forth. So it kind of motivated us, and that's why we started the African movement. Now, it also went there, from there on, we realized that we had to mobilize support, both in terms of resources. And lucky enough for us, UNESCO, the director of the Ghana representative for UNESCO, became excited after the Paris award and invited us to have a discussion with him as to what role UNESCO can play or could play in raising the level of consciousness of our people. So as a result of that interaction with the UNESCO boss, we concluded that the best way to start this reawakening is to start a series of screenings in all the major universities in Ghana, beginning with the University of Ghana, Legon, where I used to teach. So basically, we are more or less in a situation where we realize that we have to move first within the context of the intellectual academic community to raise the level of the youth, because to us, the youth represent the future. So that's where we are at the moment, and we are putting the bolts and nuts together to start our first screening at the first major universities and move from there. And then open it up to public debate, because the plan is to, when we do a screening, we'll take our cameras there and record the interaction with the students and so on and so forth, and then put it out there on social media and start opening up the debate. Because without opening up,
That seems to me really important. I mean, I see it on two fronts. I see it, for example, in Europe, that there's just no way there can be a decolonial art history without access to the sequestered collections, right? I mean, otherwise it's purely discourse-led. You can't look at anything. The material is kept underground. In Germany, if you tot up all the ethnographic museums that still exist in the federal state, you reach easily 5 million artifacts. Okay, and then when you talk about the return of 26 or 35, it becomes absurd. So what I did notice, so that's one problem, that how do we get a student body in Europe to say, hey, hold on a minute, we need to go in there. We're no longer going to be fobbed off with a Eurocentric art history or any kind of other discipline, sociology, anthropology. We want to create new understandings of the world by looking at this material in a pluridisciplinary way. In Nigeria, since I've been working there with African Artists Foundation, we sort of decided that we weren't going to wait for restitution to happen and for it to be dictated by European ministries and the European academics, right? Sorry, or the US academics, but we needed to get a conversation going. And during the COVID period, people were at home, and at home people have collections. And so the home museum was a way of saying to on a very grassroots, inclusive level, hey, hold on a minute, restitution implies that something's missing. Have you got something missing in your home right now? What would your museum be in the future? And the result was 240 entries and nearly 2,000 or more photographs of people who are both amateurs and professionals, both educated and very modest, very humble, who have started to look at what they have. And I think personally, we see that this kind of multi-layered, non-hierarchical approach to restitution is so crucial today, because otherwise it's just going to remain in the kind of closeted arenas of academic discourse. And I think that if that happens, we can wait another 50 years, right? But maybe on that note, we could bring in the audience. I believe Nick and Ike are waiting to bring questions to the both of you. Am I right? Great.
Yes, thank you so much, Clémentine. My name is Nicholas Barlow. I'm a curatorial assistant with the Hammer Museum.
And I'm Ike Onyeka, curatorial assistant, Hammer Museum. And thank you for joining us today. And yeah, we can open it up for questions. I think part of the reason Nick and I wanted to do this program was to kind of think about how the museum currently as an institution, and the Hammer is a contemporary art museum, but the fact that we have a collection, but there's also these other institutions that we are in dialogue with and we interface with. I think for Nick and I, we were interested in, as ethnographic museums are kind of like wrestling with their collections, and something that Clémentine touched on in her book was the idea of kind of contemporary collecting practices and how that may dovetail with, what we've seen within the Ethnographic Museum. So again, opening it up. So Nikia, you can go ahead with some questions.
Oh, and I just wanted to say that, so through the live stream, you can actually access, there's a little kind of speech bubble that you can select, and that will give you access to leave a question in the chat. And Ike and I will both be kind of giving questions in. I have a question. Well, I guess we can start from a question from Lucy, which is for Onyeka and Kwate. What are the opportunities and limitations of restitution and repair in the digital age? So taking into account this idea of the digital age.
I don't know, when I was kind of listening to what Clémentine was saying, I was thinking about the home museum. I was thinking about this, and something that I've encountered when talking to students is this kind of assumption that everything can be collected, and everything is going to in some way become part of some kind of collection or archive, and that we can hold everything. And for me, there is a question of power that doesn't seem to get addressed in that, because for me, something around an archive or a collection is about this distance from the people of authorship, the people who created it, and that there's power that functions in that creation. So in a kind of digital moment that we're in, there is the capacity in many ways to collect a lot more, but how do we think through who does that work and who rises to the top in terms of those kind of collections? What's foregrounded, what's put in the background? So yeah, I don't know, that's something that just came to mind.
Well, I think that for us down here, in fact, what you just mentioned, Onyeka, about the question of who are the creators and of these rare sacred artifacts. In our context, apart from the educated, the academic, kind of sector, we have the masses, the ordinary, the rural masses, whom precisely most of these artifacts were taken from various shrines and religious institutions and etc. Pre-colonial religious institutions before, for instance, when the British ransacked Kumasi, the seat of the Asante Empire, and destroyed the empire with firepower, they wiped out some of the most rare, including gold, artifacts made in all kinds of, forms and etc. And this created this vacuum. So for the ordinary people and the rural folks, the issue of course, their religious, Christianity has more or less overtaken and created a vacuum. Has filled this vacuum because first of all, they owe allegiance prior to the colonial penetration to their traditional belief system. And now this has been, overwhelmed by Christianity. So our task is, first of all, fundamentally, to not only, carry out this campaign of Afriteam within the academic and the intellectual sector, but also to translate You Hired Me into different local languages, version of You Hired Me, voiceovers, because now there is a proliferation of so many local TV stations and radio stations, which is very positive, talking about the digital, opportunities, which is great because, these radio stations and TV stations are constantly in search of material and content. So, for us, it's a wonderful opportunity. We can translate You Hired Me, do a voiceover, You Hired Me in Hausa, Akanti, Igwe, and other languages So for us, it's such an exciting period because once we're able to do this, we can then disseminate it through these local language, broadcasting stations to widen the scope of the debate and get the masses involved, because they have a lot of programs where people call in and they call and response things. So for us, it's a very exciting period. Then, of course, there are going to be challenges, ahead of us, but this is one format that we felt that we should awaken the people's consciousness about what they have lost spiritually and, in terms of their whole mindset. And then, the demand for restitution would then be a logical extension of them becoming aware, because there are religious leaders within their communities. There are very powerful shrines still in existence that have been suppressed by the whole Christian thing. And once these things starts, warming up, we think that the issue of restitution can be, a very powerful, dynamic, weapon to more or less get our government and our Ministry of Culture and so on and so forth involved in the support base. So the first and foremost thing is to go down to the base, which do the bottom up, process. We start from the bottom up. We start from the top, first of all, with the intellectual community, and then go back and start from the bottom up.
Can I just briefly on this question of the digital, because it just shows how dissemination is incredibly complex. Right now, collecting doesn't stop in so-called ethnographic museums, because what is now being collected is the digital forensic imaging of objects, and particularly ritual objects. And so if you take the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, they managed to install a hospital level MRI, magnetic resonance scanner. And within 1 week, they fed it with 150 ritual objects. And they found out knowledge that is initiate knowledge that is held by the artist who carved the object and by the priest or the holy person, the shaman, however you wish to call them, who is actually administering the knowledge, passing it on, transmitting it. And this type of forensic imaging is one way of keeping a hold on the rights of these objects, even if they are eventually restituted. It's not as if there is a discussion about who has the intellectual property of these images. It's completely taken for granted that the digitization of these artifacts is in the hands of the museum that produces it, right? That commissions it. And I think this is something for which we need to be much more vigilant. For me, it's a totally unethical procedure to take a ritual sculpture from the Songye people, put it inside an MRI scanner in order to detect that it is internal ducts, right? That the whole process of belief has been held in I wouldn't say secrecy, because that evokes too much kind of woo, right? Too much exoticism, but that there is knowledge within these artifacts that European and American museums are aware of, and that is one of the blockages to restitution. They don't know what it is. It's like having a reservoir of energy and you just can't make out why or what it is, but you're going to hold on to it for the moment, for the future.
Yeah. I think picking up on what you're saying, Clémentine, there's a moment in Onyeka's video where it says, commerce brought us and keeps us in Africa. And I think with what you're saying about like these kind of like new age ways of digital scanning and creating images, it reminds me of Mackenzie Walker wrote this interesting essay around like the image and the derivatives that come around about from the image and how that allows a circulation of commerce within the artwork. You buy artwork based on an image you see, a JPEG, and I think there's commerce in the image that in a way is preventing restitution. There's a question from Megan Metcalf, a good friend of mine, and I wanted to kind of like bring in some of what you said in the Metabolic Museum book, Clémentine, how you talked about how an ethnographic museum can exist today. And I think you referenced this Jyotindra Jain and how a contemporary ethnographic collection in the current time in collecting objects, you know. And I think what's interesting, Megan asked the question, how can a museum that shows contemporary art or other kinds of art and artifacts make use of decolonial and reparative models? And I was thinking about this idea of both Onyeka's film and Ni's film in terms of this idea of remediation that you talked about in the Metabolic Museum, and how their engagement with these collections through a filmic medium is a way to kind of, for a contemporary museum to do this work of reparative work, you know, in Onyeka's film entering into the collection in an interesting way in her engagement with an existing collection. So it's a, yeah, maybe some of you can touch on that in terms of, yeah.
Well, I'll kickstart it by just saying that, you know, for me, the question of seeing the material, access to these collections is paramount. There's no way that anything can come forward if we wait for the restitution process to take its full course. It's going to take too long. It's blocked by all sorts of kind of hitches in relic diplomacy, by all sorts of subtexts and maneuvers. And we're talking today, aren't we, about reimagining the museum? And I don't understand why we stick to the incredibly normative hang today. I mean, it's outrageous. That's why I spoke about the lazarette, because we would begin to look upwards, or we would drop the gaze, drop the hang. But we need to think differently about these spaces that are called museums. Make them into democratic spaces for study. And whether you use film or whether you decide to focus on sensory perception, which is something that comes through both films, sound, the oxygenating of these display cases that Kwate opens up, you can sense the oxygen going into them, right? You can sense the problem of touch. You guys were touching these objects. Today, you can't touch them. You can't touch them with your hands. All these questions are connected to conservation. And one of the reasons we don't get access to the collections in order to remediate them is the problem, the ideology of conservation. And in my feeling is that a museum university would enable students who don't otherwise get into the gated university, who don't otherwise hang around and linger in a museum too long, that they would begin to use the museum as a site for education, visual thinking, visual education. And that this kind of education, it has to lead to new forms of knowledge production, not art history, anthropology, sociology, but a whole new kind of hybrid way of understanding on the basis of collections. Collections are the departure point. We have to deal with them. We can't allow anthropologists to hoard this material and to tell us that they have the legitimate context. They have the legitimate ways of interpreting them. So, yeah, I think that this question affects contemporary art museums as well, of course. You know, the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, Anne Dreesen is currently working on an exhibition where she's looking at artworks that have authorship, unlike the ethnographic collections. They actually have artists named behind them, but the artists and their names have gone into oblivion, right? So there are even sort of gray zones within collections that have been purchased with all the right information at the time, which is not the case with so-called ethnographic collections. These were plundered, removed, and then reconstructed in Europe. Otherwise, what would a museum anthropologist have to do? They were armchair scientists, if anything, right? So there is a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking what can be done in a museum. Why don't we use a space differently? Why do we insist on having cafes and shops and walking through through a particular route, nowhere to sit, nowhere to study, right? So these, I think, are thankfully the fateful and yet auspicious aspects of the current situation in which we are.
See, there's
also, please. No,
there's
please.
also another spurious, argument that you hear a lot. about restitution, that is from the standpoint, from the point of view of those who are the institutions that are holding on to these artifacts, is that, hey, if we decide to return them, where are you going to store them? Do you have the facilities to store? I mean, there are all kinds of, things flying around, trying to, put the brakes, put brakes on this whole movement, like the Black, Lives Matter movement and so on and so forth. So we can apply it here because, it's a spurious argument because, for instance, in Ghana, an organization has just emerged. It has acquired over 75-acre land somewhere in the central region, and it's called the Pan-African Historical World Museum. And it's an organization that is well-funded, and its aim and objective is to set up this incredible space of a museum dealing with different, for example, there will be an area where, miniatures of different empires, like the Benin Empire, the Songhai Empire, and so on and so forth. And then there will be a museum which will be ready with all the facilities and conditions to receive these objects that have been taken away. So, among other things, the fundamental question is that, will these authorities, these museum authorities in Europe and America, will they be at a certain point in time, like the way the Black Lives Matter movement pushed the debate up to the front line, will they be prepared? For instance, the British, who were our main colonizers here, will they be prepared to relinquish and to return these artifacts? I think that we have to put pressure on them. The pressure has to be put on them, both politically and culturally, and about the way, in fact, it's so unjust for them to continue to hold on to, very precious, rare, secret, artifacts. So I think that, there are certain challenges ahead, but basically, I believe that we have to link up with folks like you and other international organizations, NGOs, and etc., and to create a network, an international and local network, a Pan-African network as well, because we're also looking at, translating, you heard me, into Swahili, into Igbo, into Yoruba, and so on and so forth. So the thing is to create a groundswell of, a very highly organized, pressure group. And at this point, at a certain point in time, they will have no alternative but to return, it sounds a very optimistic, notion, to return these objects back to their rightful owners. It's going to be a struggle, but hey, we have to keep on pushing.
I wanted to open up the question about actually, there's a question here from Amelia Hammond about conservation. So that's come up a few times, and this idea of how conservators add their practice in order to support restitution. And with that, I kind of want to merge a question I had for Onyeka about the Colonial Film Archive. And taking this term that Clémentine has used, this idea of the Metabolic Museum, this idea of a living organ, whether you think of that collection, the collection featured in No Archive Can Restore You, as a living entity, or is it an entity in decay? And to that point, is it an entity that is worth conserving? Is it an entity that needs conserving? How do we treat an archive like that is rotting, but also is questionable?
I think it's funny because when I went back to film there, the following day, when I finished the shoot, they were collecting all the film reels that they had, and they were being transferred to Jos, which is in the north of Nigeria. It's a lot cooler temperature, where the National Archive is, for this preservation and conservation effort. That, as I said before, was in association with the German Foreign Ministry. It was being funded by the German Foreign Ministry. So there is an idea that the material it's important for the material to be preserved. So I don't know, but like I was thinking, like in terms of how should conservation work, I really relate to what Clementine's been saying about like what happens when you touch the material, what happens when you use when sensorial knowledge, when like if we're talking about illegitimacy or legitimacy, when illegitimate forms of knowing are applied, like non-Western forms of knowing, non-like museum, like are used with this material, what happens then? And for me, the experience of going into this space, like it is in decay, but it is living, and I could only imagine, or like that was what I was trying to do with the film, would think about, even though I can't see the material, being in that space caused me to imagine what the material could possibly be. And maybe that imagination is as valid as what is on those films. Because if we're talking about colonial films about Nigeria, I kind of know what's already on there. It's incredibly like racist and depictions of Nigeria, and like instructional films that are supposed to instruct civilization onto people. So I already know in some way. So what does my imagination do, and what does that produce? And I think that is a living thing. That is continually happening.
A quick follow-up question to that. So Onyeka, was your filming coinciding with the eventual kind of like movement of the objects? Like if you'd filmed like a day later, would you have come upon the film unit in a different state? Like, oh yeah, I'm just curious as to like the timing of
the same state that it did when I filmed it, because the film reels have all gone. I'm not sure what's happened to the building. I think they were talking about knocking it down. But the reason why I first got interested in that, or I first even knew that space existed, because it's behind the current Nigerian Film Corporation offices. It's like in the shadow of that building, next to another paper archive actually of newspapers. I knew about that material because someone called Didi Chika had gone there when he was looking around that building and had found this like famous film in the collection amongst all these reels, and so had kickstarted this kind of conservation project with that film in particular that continued broadening out to the whole of the films in the collection. So I only knew about it because of that. So yeah, I don't know what, I actually haven't found out, but they were saying that maybe it's going to get knocked down because it's an empty kind of husk of a space in a way.
Yeah, it's interesting. This whole question of illegitimacy, and knowledge, because the very looting of these objects was an illegitimate form of acquisition, but now it's become a legitimate. So it's kind of it's paradoxical, but there's a question from Brandon Sword, which kind of gets at this. How might we address the impact of Eurocentrism, colonialism, not only on the dispersion of material culture, but also on the ways we think and what counts as knowledge? I'll just open that up.
See the second part again. The second part of the question again.
So how might we address the impact of colonialism and Eurocentrism, not only on the dispersion of material culture, so like, the looting and so forth, or the museum just as we know it now, but also on the ways we think and what counts as knowledge? So,
well, for me, I think that the issue fundamentally is the kind of structures you have on the ground. For instance, I think that one important development, recent development in the last few months or so is that through certain strategic, moves that we've made on the ground, the present government in Ghana has set up an organization, a collection of certain prominent individuals to act as a crucible to, light a fuse, or if you like, the debate on the question of restitution and the question of dissemination of knowledge about what has been appropriated with what has been, distorted in terms of national character and, national belief system and so on and so forth. So that, in a certain way, we think that, on the ground, this kind of We are ready to work with this particular organization. We've made contact with them. And we think that the issue of restitution in a final analysis and the illegitimacy of the institutions that are holding on to this thing will have to be addressed at the highest level, in terms of international law, as to, what's happening, maybe it has to be taken to the Hague or any of these international legal platforms to argue out and to, struggle there with this illegitimacy and to prove completely that this illegitimacy is a bogus illegitimacy, and that, they have to be, brought to down to the fact that they have to return these artifacts, I think, and just a little bit on the film archives, the colonial film archives. For us, I mean, for instance, the British Film Institute has an archive on the Gold Coast, beginning from 1910. Amazing archive collection of, Gold Coast film unit films. And going through the list of the archives, the material they have, I mean, they are racist in content and whatever. But for us, it provides us with an enormous amount of archival material that we can use in terms of, an analytical, process of, exposing the contradictions inherent in the whole colonial, campaign of subjugation and, appropriation of national wealth and intellectual, property, and replacing it with their own cultural dominating, influence. So, my attitude towards the colonial, heritage in terms of films is that, it's useful. They represent useful material that can be used, to actually expose what they intended to do with the material. As Onyeka pointed out, they were instructional films, how to mobilize the people to produce more cocoa for export, and how to mobilize, different, local industries set up by them in terms of infrastructure and so on and so forth. So there's a flip side to the coin.
I really agree that, like, in these films, there's multiple things going on, and I think that people should just have access to them, be able to do whatever and make whatever they want with them. But in some way, to answer the question, I think something about an idea of an ethnographic museum. If we think about ethnography and anthropology as really being tools of colonialism created in order to justify colonial endeavor, I really don't understand why ethnographic museums continue to persist if there's a serious conversation or a serious effort to break away from those kind of knowledge systems, because for me they're one and the same. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I just add that I have faith in the younger generation to, especially now, I guess that's why I kind of wanted to mention 89 and 2020 as watershed moments. I don't think we can go back now after BLM. And I mean, I think the decolonial now is with us, and that this also has to affect the way we will understand, as Onyeka has shown, how we approach an archive, how we approach this form of knowledge production. And I think that this is something that can be done. And I was surprised teaching the last 1.5 years, teaching art students and social designers in Hamburg at the Academy, how interested they are in research collections, in these endless university collections, that have been the foundations for new institutes, universities, academies, art schools, museums, and that suddenly it's there and we're not looking at it. And it's part of the controversial link that we have to work through between the analog and the digital. We can't get beyond it. And I think that these archives are going through a caput mortuum phase. They are going through a regeneration phase. And there are many more than the official ones. I mean, even in Benin City, I was amazed to see an Institute of Benin Studies, which was like the size of a shop, And it was full of vital documents on modernism, on painting in Nigeria. And let's not forget that if we focus on what is currently being commodified, i.e. the restitution debate, as if, you know what I mean? Like it's the few works that need to go back, and it becomes the only way to talk about practices on the African continent and beyond. And I think that we must be terribly cognizant of the fact that there is a 20th century development and brilliance of painting and sculpture that took place all over the African continent and its diaspora. Yeah, and we mustn't just like suddenly get sucked into this rehash of ethnographic phantasmagoria, right? Because that's what's going on with provenance studies. I mean, let's be fair, provenance studies has been brought back to enable anthropologists to continue having authority over these collections. Oh, we didn't write anything down when we took it back to Europe, did we? Because we wanted to describe it in our own words, photograph it, represent it. So now we need to find the object biographies. So we're back in the market again. Hey, we've got a job, right? And this, I think, is seriously problematic. So on the one hand, we have to have nearly heretic approaches to the reinterpretation of this material. Heretic in the sense that it doesn't follow the disciplinary classification system that we've inherited through imperialism and colonialism. No, but also that it tries in a kind of how can I put it? It turns primitivism on its head, and it says, ho, let's look at the works in the Nigerian context of Demas Nwoko, Eraboy, Mokpai, Bruce Onabrakpe, Ben Nwonu, etc., and let's recalibrate art history from this perspective and look at the works of the past in a 20th century and, of course, 21st century set of idioms, for which I believe in the younger generation. I think they'll do it.
To that point, and to Ni, something you brought up as well about the kind of complicated importance of the kind of colonial film collections for kind of Ghanaian or kind of Nigerian people to kind of use that material to as part of the kind of re-understanding or rewriting of these narratives. How important is kind of contextual or context for this material in the sense of contextual writing? And in museums, we think about didactic text, we think about tombstones, we think about artists. How important is that in relationship to this ethnographic material? Or is it just a further hollow application to kind of take further claim over it being, you know, as you talked about, Ni, in your film, this kind of establishing or kind of this hierarchy? How important is contextual work for these ethnographic works, or is it just more propaganda?
Well, I think that there are about 3 or 4 different levels of contextualization and so on and so forth. For example, I think that what Clémentine said about turning these objects on their heads, you know, and, you know, more or less trying to give a different interpretation. I mean, I think that it's important that in this debate, one should also listen to the voices of the communities where these, you know, objects were looted from. And you find that their voices are not being heard at all. And for instance, one of the, you know, projects that we initiated last year in terms of research and development is to start visiting local shrines in different parts of the country, the northern region, particularly the Ashanti region and the coastal areas, and to open up a debate in a discussion as to the context, you know, how to contextualize what has been missing from their own, you know, religious practices, and how that has created this incredible, you know, as I said, collective amnesia. so that once we start debating and discussing with them, and that's why we wanted to show You Hide Me to them in their local languages. We want to take the film to them, actually, and then open up a debate with them as to the significance of mobilizing support for them to join other organizations, both locally, and Pan-African level and internationally, to start this movement so that nobody listens to them. In fact, have you ever heard the voice of, a traditional priest or a priestess, being, articulated on the international platform as to what they think, how it has damaged their psyche and so on and so forth. So I think that for us in AfriTeam, some of the activities we are involved in is to do research into areas where we can document using film, to raise the debate, from the sources where these artifacts were taken from. In that sense, we want to put it in the context so that when we're talking about looted artifacts, we have to go to the source where these artifacts were looted. For instance, the king of Asante has a copy of You Hide Me, and he has seen it and is very excited about mobilizing the support of other traditional leaders within the Ashanti region and other, the National House of Chiefs. So in the context of, this debate of restitution, it's a major task to mobilize all the various interest groups and who are, the custodians of these, artifacts, that has been, taken away from them. So I think that's one level, which we want to, contribute to the debate, in terms of contextualization.
Nee, as a quick follow-up to that, we have a question from Lucy, which is, how can we support your organization? How can we support AfriTeam?
Okay, AfriTeam, at the moment, we have a website under construction, but we have an email address, which is afriteamtoday@gmail.com. And we've been, having a lot of mail has been coming in from, requests similar to this person who has just raised this issue. And they should write to us through our email, AfriTeam. I don't know if I can put it on the text, or
we'll have someone put it in the chat.
Okay, put it in chat. Okay, so it's like AfriTeam. Wait a minute. Where's the chat?
We can put it in the chat.
Okay.
We can put it in the chat.
Okay, put it in the chat line.
I want to pick up a question that dovetails with what you said, Clémentine, about the commodification around restitution conversations. Because, everyone just talks about the Benin bronzes, but there's so much more. And I wonder, even as we as a museum are doing this Reimagining the Museum series, the question is from Brittany. How does conversations around restitution work with other conversations around racial justice within the museums and labor practices in the current moment? And I think the reason I bring that up is that, if the museum as an institution can't even address its own pernicious structures and formations, is restitution just kind of like another thing that can dangle out there to take attention away from the very issues within the museum as a structure? So just thinking about and even as we're doing this series, Reimagining the Museum, as an institution, and I think Nick and I always were thinking about not taking the attention away from the museum as a contemporary museum and bringing things back onto ourselves. And I think this question kind of lends itself to thinking about what you said, Clémentine, also thinking about this moment we're in, 2020, Black Lives Matter, and so any response to that in terms of restitution, racial?
In Berlin, at KW, Institute for Contemporary Art, there are two exhibitions up right now. One with the work of Amélie von Wulff and another one, Leon Nielsen. They've been up now for nearly 2 months. Nobody can see them. you know, all of this has to be seen within the context of the pandemic that we're living through. And restitution, yeah, it's absolutely essential. There's no going past it. And yes, it will, I think it has to shake up the museum. It has to make people think about collections and roles in the museum. I mean, major museums in the past, the universal museums, whether it's the Met or the British Museum, they had a lot of researchers. They had custodians who were, you know, the head of Chinese antiquities or ceramics, or there were people who were specialists. And these specialists today are being questioned because their formulation of context is not the authoritative formulation of context anymore. They cannot speak about the use of objects in terms of ethnicity any longer, right? It feels incredibly uncomfortable to use the logos of ethnos in a moment like today, notwithstanding the fact that, as I mentioned before, exhibitions are being put up and no one is looking at them. So we're in a crisis that, if possible, will lead to new roles in the museum, new emancipatory forms of inquiry, new understandings of what context means. Context, it's terrible. You get an object in front of you and somebody tells you what it is about. Bingo, context. And when people walk into a museum, they expect that. And they expect the reductionism. And ultimately, I think that the most racist expression in a museum can be found in the labeling, because it's there that you reduce the complexity of meanings to a few words. And in a European context, okay, it's got a particular style, it's certainly not, got a particular language style, but when you do that onto other people's values, heritage, cultures, onto artifacts that were taken away without documented authorship, where the artist or the craftsperson or the guild was pushed to the side, it didn't count, then I think we can begin to understand the museum in a different way. And for me, the principal idea is that these museums right now in a COVID period, they are heated, they are empty, and they should be locations for rehabilitation. And rehabilitation means many things. It means trying to find a remediative method for blighted histories, for artifacts that are somehow displaced, that can't be sent back so easily either, right? That require an enormous amount of negotiation. However, there are certain things that are sine qua nons for me. For example, I don't think it's for a European museum to decide what happens to restituted artifacts. I think that there's enough iconoclasm that has taken place in relation to museum collections. Zoe Struther has just written a brilliant text on iconoclasm and museums in Nigeria, showing that when certain evangelical movements took place in the 50s and then later in the 70s, they were the moment when Kenneth Murray and the colonial Department of Antiquities could go and acquire large amounts of artifacts that were otherwise going to be drowned or burned, right? So there is a kind of a background to all this of that requires of us to be more, perhaps more open-minded, but at the same time more vigilant about what we consider certain key terms to be, such as conservation, context, authorship, the right to describe, to portray, to identify. Who has the right to do that? The right to reconfigure an archive. Can a young person come into an archive in Ibadan, Ile-Ife, and begin to completely restructure the material? Or should that young person conform to a pretty imperial idea of what an archive is, right? The A to Z, the classification according to ethnic categories, according to the divisions between certain practices. I mean, Onyeka's film on where she looks at the phenomenon of dance is extraordinary, because dance, as you quite much better than you can describe this, Onyeka, is a reductionism of a much, much more complex form of human expression, of aesthetic practice, right? Onyeka.
Well, yeah, I guess I was interested in the ways in which dance is reduced by the archive, or is reduced by the colonial gaze. And I think it points to what Nia was saying earlier about like what is contained in these kind of collections is complex. There is stuff that I've found incredibly pleasurable at the same time as being incredibly violent. So yeah, I'm interested in this imagination of how someone could reconfigure the archive. And I guess in that film was an attempt of reconfiguring that material to tell something kind of against what it was intended to tell.
And yeah, to that point about dance and like sitting with the archive, I want to go back to something you said early on. In unlearning reverence, and I think this unlearning cuts across from both you as an artist to the museum in terms of unlearning, but I think using you as a kind of like a jumping pad. In unlearning reverence, does the reverence shift, and where does it shift to, or is there like a new posture that emerges regarding the archive other than reverence? And I know in one of the essays you wrote for Feminist Review, you talked about like blood memory, and I wonder where does that operate in the unlearning and this posture of reverence? Because that was a really beautiful essay that you wrote.
Thank you. I think for me, the unlearning is about multiplicity. Is not about raising a particular way of knowing to be the only way. I think there's multiple ways. For me, yes, dance and movement has been a way in which I've thought through ideas, in which I have come to some kind of conclusion, or like, I don't know. It's been a process of thought in the same way in which writing or reading is, you know? So it's, for me, about multiplicity, about there being lots of different ways laid across each other in kind of relation to one another, rather than the reverence for the archive being replaced by a reverence for, I don't know, orality, for example. It's not about a straight swap. It's about how can all of these things sit on top of each other? Because I'm very aware that coming from a British context, from like, as I said, being socialized and educated in this particular culture, lots of these different ways of knowing exist in me, and I can encounter them in lots of different places. So what would it be like if there wasn't a valorization? Something didn't like rise to the top. Instead, there was a relation between everything.
I wanted to, so I think we should begin winding it up. And I wanted to actually quickly introduce, we have a final film playing after this conversation. And that film is Statues Also Die by Chris Marker and Alain Resnais. Filmed in the Museum of Man in 1953, Statues Also Die is an influential essay directed by Chris Marker and Alain Resnais. The film was commissioned by Présence Africaine, a Pan-African quarterly cultural, political, literary magazine founded by the Senegalese writer Alain Diop in 1947. The film uses dramatic and innovative editing and camera techniques in an attempt to remediate African artifacts within the museum. The groundbreaking documentary offers a damning critique of ethnographic institutions, which initially prompted the French Ministry of Culture to censor it upon its release in 1953. Before we wind up, I just wanted to actually ask quickly of all of you guys, and especially of Kwate and Onyeka, when you first became aware of this film of Statues Also Die, and also your thoughts about it. If it is something you think holds up, if you think it is something that is deeply flawed, if there is something that you like about it, I'd be interested to know how it relates to your practice and how you both consider the film now.
Well, believe it or not, I haven't seen the film. I've read a lot about it. And I remember that the first person who asked me that question was when You Hide Me was first premiered at the Africa Center. Somebody in the audience said, "Look, you must see this documentary by Chris Marker," and so on and so forth, and that it has a bearing on your perspective, where you are coming from, and so on and so forth. So it's unfortunately I have never been able to locate that film, to see it in order for me to give you a more in-depth, response or reaction to your question. And I'm really anxious to see it, myself for the first time. And hey.
I'm so curious for your reaction when you see it. I really want to know.
Yeah, same here.
I saw it. I think I got reintroduced to it with Duncan Campbell's film, which is the title I completely have forgotten, that won the Turner Prize in early 2000s or something, which kind of revisited the film, and I watched it then. And then I watched Nee's film for the first time, You Hide Me, last summer, when June Giovanni put on some events and screened the film. And then I watched Statues Also Die again after that in preparation for some teaching. And I mean, my first impression when I first watched the film was, I was kind of interested, and I always felt this strong feeling about the way in which the objects were filmed. Very much went against just the words that were being said. There was this conflict between the content of this kind of protest, or this kind of criticality that the film has, versus how the objects were kind of filmed and considered. And yeah, when I watched You Hide Me, I just thought that it's so striking, the contrast in the approach to these materials, and something that's so strident about what comes about in You Hide Me is missing. And I guess it's a kind of effective connection or relationship to the material, which is missing from this kind of studied distance that Marker has.
Clémentine, that's actually, I mean, to Onyeka's point, that's very similar to what you mentioned in your book about the kind of photography of African artifacts and this kind of spotlight that is often used for this ethnographic studies.
Yeah, all I can say is that I'm dying to know what Kwate thinks of it.
Yeah. We'll have to have a follow-up on our WhatsApp chat. Well, I wanted to thank you all for participating. Ike and I are incredibly grateful for you guys taking the time to do this program and to talk with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you so much, Onyeka, Clémentine, and Nee. Thank you both. Thank you all. And I also wanted to thank our Hammer AV and digital production team, especially Brian Springer, Alexander Barrera, Flora Campanillo, and Robert Lovelace, and Mike Rice. And finally, a thank you to RM Moshietti for his introduction and guidance in formulating and organizing this program. A final note really fast about this stream. Oh, okay.
One thank you to Erica P. Jones at the Fowler Museum. Shout out to Erica. Couldn't be here.
Yeah.
Love you. Yeah.
A final thing about this screening. So the program with Nee and Onyeka's films will live on our website for 7 days until February 7th. So if you missed it or you want to watch the films again, that will be living on our site. This is a live screening and the only screening of Statues Also Die. So if you miss it this time, you'll have to find it somehow. Thank you all. Any final notes, anything that anyone wants to say, or?
So thanks very much for the invitation. I really, really enjoyed talking with everyone today.
Yeah, I mean, like my sister, we are really excited about the way forward, because this is not just talk. We want to translate all these ideas, debates, and discussions into, concrete action in a program of, where do we go from here? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Hey, I enjoyed being here. It was great.
Thank you. And I would like to really stress how important it is that artists are involved in these questions. Thank you, Onyeka. Thank you, Kwate. Great to see you again.
Pleasure.
Thank you all. And thank you all for tuning in. And now Statues Also Die from 1953.